Morning I've titled the message Lessons of Lions. Lessons of Lions. And we'll see why as we go this morning. It's in Daniel chapter 6, so if you have your Bible, go ahead and turn to the book of Daniel. Chapter 6, book of Daniel in the Old Testament, one of the Old Testament prophets. And we're going to look at that this morning. You know, we do live in the freest country in the world.
Amen.
We do, and we're grateful for that. That freedom has been protected by many who sacrificed their lives to do so, and many who have fought and did not have to pay the ultimate price, but they fought and risked it nonetheless for our freedom which we enjoy today. And we are grateful. We're grateful that we can worship like this. There's places in the world right now where if Christians gather to worship, forces will come in and arrest them and perhaps kill them in some places. And so we're very grateful that we do have the freedoms that we have today. But I must say, and I've noticed that society even here is not as friendly to the Christian and Christian values as it once was. And you know that if you've noticed and lived a while, you've noticed this. In the past, Christian values were celebrated in our nation. That's not so anymore. Right now, Christian values are criticized. And in fact, there's been activities of the government which some would view as hostile to churches and Christianity. Just yesterday, there was a Supreme Court verdict, and the case was brought by a church in Nevada. And here was the circumstance. In Nevada, they said churches have to close down. You can't gather together, citing the health concerns. All right? But the casinos were okay. So it wasn't an even thing. They didn't say everybody can't meet. They picked and chose who could meet and who couldn't. And the ones who couldn't were the churches. So it went to the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, the Supreme Court sided with the state of Nevada. That's not good news for churches. It's not. And there's been similar things that have happened in certain places. So we're finding that our society is a little more hostile towards churches, towards Christianity, than it used to be. We still have great freedoms here, and we're grateful for that. But it's something that we need to take note of. And it's something that we need to know, how would God have us handle it when we face persecution? We don't face the kind of persecution that they have in other places, and I'm glad, and I don't want it here. But we do face some persecution, even here. So what do you do when you find yourself persecuted for your faith? Well, I think we can learn some lessons from Daniel, the prophet in the Old Testament. And we're going to read an account from his life that's recorded for us in the book of Daniel in chapter 6. This is the famous passage of where Daniel is thrown in the lion's den. And kind of the background for this is Daniel, he had been taken captive when the Babylonians came and they captured Judea and they captured Jerusalem and they took people captive back to Babylon. And Daniel was in that group of folks that had been taken back to Babylon. Well, years passed by and Daniel was still in Babylon, and Babylon fell to the Medes. The Medes took over the Babylonian Empire, and Daniel was there, and so there's a new king in town, Darius the Mede, the Bible calls him, and this king, he's reorganizing some things, and that's where we find ourselves in the passage this morning. He has reorganized the entire kingdom under 150 satraps, and those 150 are governed by 3 governors. Daniel is one of those 3 governors. And as we're going to see, he really distinguished himself, and the king really liked Daniel better than the other 2, which that set up some conflict, and we're going to see that this morning as we read through the passage. And it's a long passage, so we're going to read it as we go, but we'll read all of it. But we want to look today at 4 lessons about religious persecution that we can find in this passage today. Daniel was a person who endured religious persecution in his day. And the way he reacted can teach us how we ought to react today. So the first one are the reasons for persecution. Look at verses 1 through 3 of Daniel chapter 6. It says, "It pleased Darius to set over the kingdom 120 satraps, to be over the whole kingdom, and over these 3 governors, of whom Daniel was one, that the satraps might give account to them, so that the king would suffer no loss." Daniel was one of those stop-loss officers, right? He was to make sure that the satraps were doing their job and that the king got all that he was supposed to get, all the taxes. Then this Daniel distinguished himself above the governors and satraps, because an excellent spirit was in him, and the king gave thought to setting him over the whole realm. Daniel did such a good job that the king was really kind of eyeing him, saying, you know what, that Daniel, he's a good guy. I'm thinking about setting him over the whole kingdom, just letting him be the second one in charge under me. So Daniel was doing all right. He was doing well in his job, very well in his job. He had been placed in a position of authority, and the king was even about to give him even more authority. Well, those were reasons why people came gunning for him. There's a few reasons here. Prosperity. Daniel prospered in his work. Well, guess why Daniel prospered in his work? It was God's blessing on him. Now, God blesses his people when his people live for him and operate according to his principles in their locations. Daniel was in a rough spot. He was taken out of his homeland, taken to Babylon, and now the kingdom had changed over to another kingdom now. So he had lots of reasons to despair, to give up, but he didn't give up. In fact, he excelled even in bad situations because he was living according to godly principles. When we follow God, even though situations might be rough, we're not promised to float on a cloud, like that. Daniel was going through some rough stuff, but God caused him to prosper even in that situation. And he does that for us today. Sure, we're going to go through some bumps, but God's going to go with us through the bumps. And he's going to take care of us. And he's going to prosper us. And so they were jealous of this. They were jealous of Daniel's prosperity. They were jealous of all this. Well, look, the king likes him better than us. We don't like that. That's the way it was. People might be jealous of you when they see God blessing you too. Happens sometimes. Power. Daniel had some power that was granted to him. He was one of 3 that were over the entire kingdom. And he was really being considered to be number 2, right under the king. That's a pretty high position. Now, in our system of government in the United States, we have 3 branches of government. You've got an executive branch, which is the president. You've got a legislative branch, which is the Congress. And you've got a judicial branch, which is the court system. The power is divided, but back then the king had all the power, all of it. And so if you were second in command underneath the king, that means you were the court, the legislature, and the executive all in one. That was a big power that he was about to be granted. These other guys were jealous of that. They didn't want to see him get all that power. Now, God was blessing him. That's the reason he was put in that position. There's no other earthly reason why he should be in that position. He was taken there as a slave. Now, how does a slave become second in command in the whole country? Well, it's God's blessing on his life. That's how. So they were jealous of that. They didn't like that. They wanted to persecute him because of that. And his preeminence. He was excellent in his work. And also, he had the favor of the king. And he had the favor of the king because he did good work. If you do good work, if you're living like a Christian ought to live and you're doing good work for your employer, well, you'll probably go places if you got a good employer who is willing to promote you, right? So he was going places because he worked with excellence. Working with excellence is a Christian value. It is. We're told to work with excellence for our employer in the Bible. And so when that happens, then of course, when promotions come, well, guess who's going to get it? The one who's doing the good work, the one who's doing the good job. That's the way it's supposed to work. And so that's the way it was working for him. The king was eyeing him for a very important position, and that made some other people mad. Oh, if you get the promotion and somebody else wanted it, that's what was happening here. Okay. So these things, they were jealous of these things. When God blesses his people, sometimes others get jealous. You know, there are some people who just don't have any hope in life, and they don't want anybody else to have any hope either. Misery loves company. That's the old saying, right? That's exactly the way some people think about it. If I'm miserable, I want everybody else to be just as miserable as I am. That's the way they try to, well, that's what's happening here. I thought about the old Smothers Brothers. Some of you might remember them. They had this comedy routine, Mom always loved you best. One of them was saying to the other one, Mom always loved you best. And he complained about getting the dumb old chicken. Remember that one? And he said, well, you wanted the chicken. Well, it's still a dumb old chicken. You know, he's just mad. Mom always loved you best. Some people are just like that. They see you doing well. They see you getting good things. They're just angry about it because they feel slighted somehow or other. Sometimes that happens. When we're faithful and God's blessing, somebody's going to come along in the old cold water committee and try to dampen it down. Be faithful anyway, though. Don't let that discourage you. Just realize that's human nature, and there's going to be some folks who don't like to see you succeed, but succeed anyway. I saw a meme on Facebook that said, the best revenge is success. Don't do it just to get revenge, but I mean succeed. Succeed because God wants us to be excellent in what we do. Be excellent in what you do to honor God in what you do, and He blesses when we do that. Well, the second lesson that we have is the route of persecution. How did they go about the persecution in that day? Well, verses 4 through 9 talk about that. Those first couple of verses, we see an investigation. Oh, people love their investigations, don't they? Verses 4 and 5 says, so the governors and satraps sought to find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. They were looking for dirt. They were. Hey, let's see if we can dig up some dirt on old Daniel. Maybe there's some shady deal that we can dig up. Maybe we can look and see if he didn't do the books just right or something, you know, something they were going to try to find something on him. So find some charge against Daniel concerning the kingdom. But they could find no charge or fault. They didn't find a thing. Now, there was, 120 and then 2 others. So there's a lot of people looking into this, and they still couldn't find anything. That's because Daniel was doing it right. If you're doing it right, they're not going to find anything, right? So that's what was happening. So we see the investigation. And it says they could find no charge or fault because he was faithful. Nor was there any error or fault found in him. He wasn't at fault, and he didn't even make any mistakes. That's pretty good. Then these men said, we shall not find any charge against Daniel unless we find it against him concerning the law of his God. The only thing that they could get him on is his devotion to God. And so that's what they decided to use against him, was his devotion to God. He wasn't cooking the books. He wasn't cheating the king. He was doing what he was supposed to do. They couldn't get him on any of that, so they said, well, okay, he loves God, so we're going to get him on that. That's what we're going to get him on. So the investigation. And then there was litigation. We see that in verses 6 through 9. They went through the court system of the day. Well, back then the king was the court, right? You go to the king's court to make your case, and that's what they did. In verse 6 it says, so these governors and satraps thronged before the king and said thus to him, King Darius, live forever. Oh, they're buttering him up real good. All the governors of the kingdom and administrators and satraps and counselors and advisors have consulted together to establish a royal statute and to make a firm decree that whoever petitions any god or man for 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast to the den of lions. Well, now they are playing to his arrogance. They're saying, we like you so much, King Darius, that here's what we want to do. We want a law passed that says for 30 days, that's temporary, but for 30 days, nobody can pray to any god except you. Now, they're playing to him being on an ego trip. Back then, some of the pagan kings claimed to be gods. Sometimes I wonder if there's some in our government that think they're gods too. But anyway, but that's the thing they wanted to pass. Now look, verse 8. Now, O king, established the decree and signed the writing so that it cannot be changed according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Therefore, King Darius signed the written decree. Woo, that sounds good to me, he said, so he signed it. Put it into law. 30 days, nobody could pray to anybody except the king. Basically, you banned all religion for 30 days to pray to the king. Now, this was a temporary thing, 30 days. But still, he's setting himself up as God for 30 days. 30 days. In our day, there's investigation and litigation that's used to persecute Christians too. It happens today. Now, not to this extent. I'm glad. I'm glad that we don't have anybody in our government that signed such a law. But the court system is used to combat Christian values, right? Christians believe that life is sacred. From the womb to the tomb. Well, you got Roe versus Wade, you got stuff like that. Goes against Christian values. Made it the law of the land. There's other things too. Sometimes folks will use the legal system to try to suppress or persecute Christians and those with Christian values. It happens. So it's not something that's new in our day. It's new to us because in this country it didn't used to be that way. But it's not new. This happened a long, long time ago. The kingdom of the Medes and the Persians, that was hundreds of years BC. It was happening then and it's still happening now. So we need to be vigilant and watch out for these things that happen and know what to do in response. We're going to get to that in just a moment. But one thing that we need to be careful of is don't give people anything to work with. Daniel did an excellent job. They couldn't find anything wrong with him. If you give them something to work with, to use against you, they'll use it. Oh, how many of us have heard people say, all those hypocrites down at the church. That's the biggest thing that people like to throw up. Hypocrites down at the church. Now, if you ask them for an example of that, they probably can't give you one. But that's the excuse that they use, right? But don't give them anything to work with, right? Right. Don't give them anything to work with. Maintain your integrity. Maintain your integrity. There's times when it's tempting to fudge a little bit, to cut corners a little bit. Don't do that. Live your life with excellence like God would have you to live it, so that you're not giving those who would persecute you anything to work with. If they do anything, let it be for persecuting you for loving the Lord, not for anything else. If I'm persecuted for loving the Lord, so be it. I'm guilty. Go ahead. But don't let it be for anything else. Well, the third lesson is the response to persecution. What happened? Look at verse 10. It says, now when Daniel knew that the writing was signed, he went home. Now he knew about it because he was in a high position. He was privy to what was going on in the king's court. He knew about it. He went home, and in his upper room, with his windows open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees. Now notice his windows were open, where everybody could see what he was doing. He didn't try to hide it. Right out there, open towards Jerusalem. That was the custom, to pray towards Jerusalem, pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Open towards Jerusalem, he knelt down on his knees 3 times a day and prayed and gave thanks before his God, as was his custom since early days. This was not something new. He had been praying all this time, and he continued praying. He just kept on doing what God had called him to do. It didn't change a thing. The day before this thing was signed, Daniel prayed 3 times a day, kneeling down with his window open toward Jerusalem. The day that they signed it, Daniel prayed 3 times a day, kneeling down with his window open toward Jerusalem. Didn't change a thing. That's because God's law comes first. God's law comes first. Now, as Christians, we're told in the Bible to be subject to the governing authorities, and we are supposed to do that. But when the governing authority tries to undo what God has told us to do, or tell us to go contrary to what God has told us to do, to place themselves above God, we're not obligated to obey that. Look at Acts chapter 5, verse 27. We see another example of this in the New Testament. Acts chapter 5, verse 27. Now, the backdrop here is the disciples in the early church. They were being persecuted. And they were brought before the council. And we're going to see what happened. They had threatened them before and told them not to preach about Jesus. They didn't like hearing about Jesus. They didn't want anybody else to hear about Jesus either. And guess what? They got caught preaching about Jesus. So here's what happened. Acts chapter 5, verse 27 says, "And when they had brought them, they set them before the council. And the high priest asked them, saying, Did we not strictly command you not to teach in this name? And look, you have filled Jerusalem with your doctrine." That's what we need to do, fill the town with the doctrine, right? Fill it with the doctrine. And intend to bring this man's blood on us. Now that's kind of ironic, because when Jesus was crucified, you know what they had said? Let his blood be on us and on our children. Well, now they don't want that to happen. But anyway, verse 29. "But Peter and the other apostles answered and said, We ought to obey God rather than men." Well, that's pretty blunt, wasn't it? But it's true. If you have to make a choice between obeying God or obeying the government, guess who wins? God. So don't put me in that position, because that's how I'm going to choose. I'm going to choose to obey God rather than government. You know, don't put me in that position. As a Christian, as a follower of Jesus Christ, I must obey God rather than anybody else. So just don't set yourself up against God, because you know who I'm going to choose. Every Christian ought to do that. That's what Daniel did. Now, he didn't riot. He didn't burn anything down. He didn't loot any place. He didn't cause a ruckus. He didn't fight anybody. He went home and he did what he had been doing all along. Christians are not supposed to be violent people. Violence is not a Christian value. But he did what God told him to do without fail, and let the chips fall where they fell. That's what believers are supposed to do. That's what believers are supposed to do. So don't allow anything or anybody to keep you from doing what God has called you to do. Basically, we serve God no matter what. That's the idea. And that's something we need to set our minds to while things are still good before they get bad. If we set that in our minds that, you know what, I'm going to serve God no matter what, We've already made up our mind that we'll stand stronger when persecution comes. And that's what we need to do. In doing so, we honor God and bring glory to Him. And then we're going to see the results of the persecution. That's the fourth lesson, the results of persecution. You know, God took care of Daniel. Daniel took care of God's business, and God took care of Daniel. Look at what happened, verses 11 and following. Now we see some things here. We see there was some spying going on in verse 11 of our Daniel chapter 6. It says, these men, that's talking about all the satraps and governors, all those people, these men assembled and found Daniel praying and making supplication before his God. You know, they had been watching him, and they knew what time of day he prayed. 3 times a day. They knew it. And after they got the document signed, they said, ooh, boy, we got him now. Okay, we're going to gather around the window at the right time, and we're going to catch him. And that's what they did. He got down on his knees to pray just like he always did. They're like, yep, we got him. We got him. They were spying. Then they were snitching. Verses 12 through 15 says, and they went before the king. Oh boy, they were happy about this, weren't they? They went before the king and spoke concerning the king's decree. Have you not signed the decree that every man who petitions any god or man within 30 days, except you, O king, shall be cast into the den of lions? So they asked a question, and of course they knew the answer would be yes, because the king had just signed that not too long ago. The king answered and said, the thing is true, according to the law of the Medes and Persians, which does not alter. Once it's in the law, it's in the law. You can't change it. So they answered and said before the king, that Daniel, who's the one of the captives from Judah, does not show due regard for you, O king, or for the decree that you've signed, but makes his petition 3 times a day. They're snitching now. Oh, king, you signed that decree, and this Daniel guy from Judah, he's not listening. He's not listening. 3 times a day. He didn't just break it once, but 3 times a day, king. And the king, when he heard these words, was greatly displeased with himself, and set his heart on Daniel to deliver him, and he labored till the going down of the sun to deliver him. So the king even didn't want to persecute him. But they had manipulated the situation where the law was already signed. There really wasn't a whole lot he could do about it at that point. And these men approached the king, verse 15, and said to the king, know, O king, that it's the law of the Medes and Persians, that no decree or statute which the king establishes may be changed. They reminded the king, O king, you've already signed it now. You can't go back on it now. It's the law. You got to carry on with it. So that was the situation, the snitching. Then there was a sentencing, verses 16 and 17. So the king gave the command, and they brought Daniel and cast him into the den of lions. But the king spoke, saying to Daniel, your God, whom you serve continually, he will deliver you. Then a stone was brought and laid at the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring, and with the signets of his lords, that the purpose concerning Daniel might not be changed. Okay, that was the sentence. Put him in the lion's den. That's what was in the law. That's what they had to do. But then we see salvation, verses 18 through 27. You know, God didn't abandon Daniel. He didn't abandon Daniel. He won't abandon us either. It says, now the king went to his palace and spent the night fasting, and no musicians were brought before him. Also his sleep went from him. So he didn't sleep, he didn't eat, he didn't listen to any music. He was worried about Daniel. Verse 19. Then the king rose very early in the morning and went in haste to the den of lions. He hurried to get out there. And when he came to the den, he cried out with a lamenting voice to Daniel. The king spoke, said to Daniel, Daniel, servant of the living God, has your God whom you serve continually been able to deliver you from the lions? Now, he didn't want Daniel to get eaten by the lions, and he was really hoping that Daniel's God did deliver him. So he called out to see. Then Daniel said to the king, O king, live forever. He wasn't disrespectful to the king even then. We should still be respectful. We just do what God tells us to do. Verse 22. My God sent his angel, shut the lion's mouth, so that they have not hurt me, because I was found innocent before him. See, God took care of him. And also, O king, I have done no wrong before you. All this was true. The king didn't come back and say, oh yeah, you did. No, he didn't. He knew it was true. Now the king was exceedingly glad for him, and commanded that they should take Daniel up out of the den. So Daniel was taken up out of the den, and no injury whatsoever was found on him, because he believed in his God. Notice that. Because he believed in his God. Trust God. Trust God. Do what God says and trust him to take care of the situation. And the king gave the command, and they brought those men who had accused Daniel, and they cast them into the den of lions, them, their children, their wives, and the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Before they hit the bottom of the den, the lions had jumped on and broke their bones. Now you know it was God that kept the lions from eating Daniel. Obviously they were hungry, because they went after these guys when they threw them in, right? But God sent the angel to close the lion's mouth where they couldn't do anything to Daniel. But now these guys, they didn't have that protection. They didn't believe in God. And so the lions overpowered them and broke all their bones in pieces before they ever came to the bottom of the den. Then King Darius wrote to all peoples. Now this is what he wrote. This is his next decree. To all peoples, nations, languages that dwell in the earth, peace be multiplied to you. I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom men must tremble and fear before the God of Daniel. Isn't that a change? For he is the living God, and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one which shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues. He works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. Who has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions? That situation changed real quick, didn't it? You know, if God can cause the pagan king to issue a decree like that, he can take care of what we're facing too, can't he? Oh, the government's corrupt. It is. But God can take care of a corrupt government. There was a corrupt one here. God took care of that. He can take care of the one we're dealing with today. That's right. Nothing is beyond God's power. God can shut the lion's mouth. He can open the mouth of the king to say something like this. He can take care of those situations. And even if it should be God's will for us to leave this world, we know where we're going, don't we? We're going to be with Him. So if we live here, we live for Christ. If we die, we're going to be with Christ. There ain't a thing to worry about. Not one thing. I can walk with Jesus here, or I can walk with Him up there, but I'm going to be walking with Jesus one way or another. That's the attitude that Daniel had. That's the attitude that we should have today. And so we also see the success in verse 28. So this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian, the one that came after Darius. He was still prospering. God took care of Daniel through all the changes of government, through all the changes of this kingdom and this one taking over that one, and wars and all kinds of things that were going on. God took care of Daniel. And He can take care of you and I as well. Daniel knew that God was in control of human history. God had given Daniel visions of what would happen in the future. And he realized that God is orchestrating all of these kingdoms and things that were happening, all the way from the Babylonians to the Medes to the Persians and on beyond that. He had visions of all of that God had revealed to him. He knew that God was in control of human history, and that God was in control of all the forces in heaven and on earth. And he trusted God, and God blessed him. When we trust God, God blesses us as well. God's in control. This country's here because God put it here. And it will be here as long as God wants it to be here. God's in control. So we trust. Does that mean that we just sit and twiddle our thumbs? No, we should do what we should. Like Daniel, he was busy. He was busy doing what he was supposed to be doing. We should as well. We should do it with excellence, whatever we do, and do it for God's glory. And operate within our society in the place that we have, and use that influence for God's glory and for His kingdom's sake. But ultimately realize that God's in control of everything. And that God's will is good, and He will do what's right in the end. In the end, Jesus wins. I read the back of the book. Jesus wins. He wins. Make sure you're on His side. Make sure you're on His side. Because that's the winning side. Let's pray.